The stench of filth is not always physical. Sometimes it is the quiet, rotting whisper that creeps into the corners of the mind, the unacknowledged guilt that seeps like water through cracked walls, the subtle corruption of the soul we refuse to name. Imagine walking through a city at night, streets slick with rain, neon signs reflecting in puddles that smell faintly of decay. You pass an alleyway stacked with garbage, rats scuttling through the remnants of yesterday's feasts. Yet the smell that haunts you lingers somewhere deeper than the asphalt. It is in your thoughts, your impulses, the secret yearnings you dare not confess even to yourself. Carl Jung might call it the shadow, the dark, unlit side of the psyche, where all denied truths and repressed instincts accumulate like a toxic sediment. The shadow is not external. It is the inner mire of what we refuse to confront. What is it about humanity that so often recoils from its own filth? Nietzsche argued that humans are creatures who must suffer their own consciousness. Yet we dress our suffering in virtue and moral cleanliness, pretending our shadows are someone else's problem. Filth, in this sense, is not merely physical, rotting teeth, greasy hands, or sullied streets, but psychological, ethical, and spiritual. It is the uncomfortable realization that beneath the veneer of civility lies a chaos that no amount of order, law, or propriety can entirely sanitize. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer observed that every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. We are prone to this blindness, believing that the filth we see outside, be it societal corruption, moral decay, or cultural degradation, is distant from the inner muck we harbor in our minds. Yet this inner filth is unavoidable. It festers quietly, waiting for cracks in our self-deception to emerge. Jung contended that when the shadow remains unconscious, it manifests in projection. The despised qualities we refuse to own appear in others, igniting conflict, prejudice, and violence. Consider the political scapegoating that arises from collective denial, or the moral panic that grips societies when they sense an uncontrollable impurity among outsiders. This is the age of filth, not just in streets or media headlines, but in the human soul itself, where denial creates a hall of mirrors, reflecting all that we hate in the world while concealing the rot within. And yet, there is a paradox. Filth is simultaneously repulsive and revealing. The recognition of our own shadow is both terrifying and liberating. Jung writes, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The process of confronting what we hide, the moral compromises, the selfish desires, the base instincts, forces us to reckon with what it means to be human. But this reckoning is rarely gentle. To see the rot is to feel its stink on your own hands. The moral, psychological, and spiritual implications of ignoring our filth are profound. Societies crumble, personal relationships fray, and the mind becomes a battleground for projections and neuroses. The question then becomes urgent. How do we face the age of filth when its roots are buried deep within us? Is it possible to cleanse without self-deception? Or are we destined to wander through puddles of decay, both inside and outside, until we are consumed by them? This is not merely a philosophical abstraction. It is a lived reality for millions, a silent, pervasive condition of modern consciousness. The filth is everywhere, yet we walk as if blind, stepping over what our souls already know to be there. And the more we deny it, the more it grows, until the mirror cracks and we can no longer distinguish self from shadow, order from chaos, purity from corruption. The city streets, slick and glimmering in the rain, fade into darkness. The smell lingers, insistent, intimate, and inescapable. It whispers, "Look inside, or be consumed by what you refuse to see." And there, in that whisper, lies the first step toward understanding the age of filth. A journey not through history or newsprint, but through the labyrinth of the human psyche itself. The night does not only conceal, it amplifies. Once the inner filth is acknowledged, its reflection in the world becomes impossible to ignore. Streets soaked with rain now shimmer with more than puddles. They mirror the chaos of our collective unconscious. The age of filth is not merely a private torment but a contagion, seeping into social structures, institutions, and cultural norms. In the same way that a single neglected wound can infect the body, so too can the unexamined shadows of countless individuals spread through societies, shaping behaviors, ideologies, and even laws. Jung warned that the unrecognized shadow, when projected outward, becomes a force that drives historical and political upheaval. It is the unseen hand behind intolerance, fanaticism, and the relentless pursuit of moral certainty, an unsettling paradox in which the cleanest facades often conceal the darkest impulses. History offers stark illustrations. Think of regimes built on purity, whether racial, ideological, or religious, that insisted on eradicating the impure, only to reveal the grotesque extremes of human cruelty. This is filth codified into policy, human suffering sanitized into statistics, and conscience anesthetized by dogma. Aldous Huxley observed, "Experience is not what happens to you. It is what you do with what happens to you." When societies fail to confront their collective shadows, experience becomes a repetitive nightmare, each generation inheriting the unresolved filth of the last. The street, once merely a metaphor, becomes an arena where our hidden impulses, greed, envy, lust for domination, play out on a social scale, feeding back into the minds of citizens who mistake the projections of others for objective reality. Yet the contagion is subtler than mass atrocities. It permeates daily life in forms both banal and insidious. The gossip that poisons neighborhoods, the systemic injustices that become normalized, the casual cruelty hidden behind polite smiles. Jean-Paul Sartre's idea that hell is other people gains a grim literalness here. Our neighbors, co-workers, and leaders become mirrors reflecting the filth we refuse to name within ourselves. The more we project, the more we externalize our moral corruption, and the less we recognize the interdependence of conscience and community. Filth is not simply individual, it is cultural, and in the modern age, it spreads faster than any contagion, through screens, headlines, and networks, carrying the shadows of billions into the intimate space of each mind. There is also a grotesque beauty in this recognition. Nietzsche's aphorism, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster," resonates on the societal scale. The very act of confronting cultural filth risks replicating it if approached without awareness. In politics, activism, or moral outrage, the righteous often find themselves consuming the same corruption they sought to eradicate, unaware that their shadow has grown heavier with every battle. Understanding the age of filth requires not moral posturing, but relentless self-examination, acknowledging the parts of ourselves that yearn for power, control, or vindication even as we denounce these impulses in others. Only then can we begin to identify the structural filth in our institutions and communities without being consumed by it ourselves. The contagion of shadows does not end at ethics or culture. It infiltrates perception itself. We begin to see impurity where it does not exist, interpreting ambiguity as threat, difference as decay. Viktor Frankl, who survived the deepest human horrors, reminds us that meaning can emerge even from suffering. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Recognizing the age of filth is the first act of transformation. It requires not fleeing from darkness, but stepping deliberately into it, tracing the lines of contagion from our own psyche into the architecture of society, and daring to ask what is ours, and what is only a projection. Only in this confrontation can the shadow lose its dominion. Rain continues to fall on the city streets. The puddles, once reflecting only neon and asphalt, now shimmer with the weight of countless unseen choices, desires, and denials. In the mirror of the collective unconscious, every moral compromise, every neglected impulse, becomes visible, staining our culture with an inescapable truth. We are the architects of our own corruption. The age of filth is not out there. It is everywhere, and the first challenge is not to clean the streets, but to clean ourselves. The rot begins quietly. It does not announce itself with fanfare or warning. It settles into habits, thoughts, and silent justifications, like mildew spreading beneath a freshly painted wall. Each decision to ignore, rationalize, or repress contributes to a slow moral decay, imperceptible until the cracks are too wide to conceal. The individual, much like society, projects its inner filth outward, attempting to disinfect the world while refusing to confront the impurity festering within. Schopenhauer reminds us, Compassion is the basis of morality. Yet what happens when compassion is eroded, corroded by indifference, self-interest, or fear? The erosion is silent, incremental, and terrifying, leaving the individual vulnerable to a creeping nihilism that whispers, "If everyone else is rotten, why should I resist?" In this rot, the psyche becomes a theater of contradictions. Desire and shame collide, honesty and self-deception dance, and the conscience oscillates between judgment and denial. Jung's notion of the shadow is particularly relevant here. When we refuse to acknowledge our darker impulses, jealousy, cruelty, envy, greed, they do not disappear. Instead, they gain autonomy, shaping our actions unconsciously. One may outwardly appear virtuous, yet the mind orchestrates subtle betrayals, silent manipulations, and moral compromises that accumulate into a weight that can crush the soul. It is the paradox of human consciousness. Awareness exists, yet ignorance can be chosen, and in choosing it, the mind cultivates its own decay. The psychological consequences are profound. Anxiety becomes chronic, relationships deteriorate under unspoken resentments, and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness takes root. Jean-Paul Sartre's insight that man is condemned to be free gains new resonance in this context. Freedom carries responsibility, but the conscious avoidance of shadow distorts that freedom, bending it toward destructive repetition. Guilt, suppressed and unprocessed, mutates into projection, blame, and resentment. The filth we refuse to confront becomes a lens through which we perceive the world, coloring interactions, ambitions, and even our sense of self. Every insult we harbor, every injustice we tolerate silently, every moral compromise deepens the interior rot, making ethical and emotional clarity ever more elusive. The rot is not only moral, it is deeply existential. Viktor Frankl's reflections on suffering illuminate this darkness. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. In the age of filth, that space is frequently clogged with noise, fear, rationalization, and denial, preventing the individual from exercising that freedom with integrity. The consequence is a life that feels simultaneously urgent and hollow, a constant tension between the impulse to act rightly and the inertia of ethical decay. One is haunted by the sense of being complicit in one's own corruption, yet paralyzed by the very mechanisms that protect the ego from shame and guilt. There is, however, a subtle opportunity embedded within the rot. The recognition of decay, when embraced fully, can catalyze transformation. Aldous Huxley observed, "There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception." The filth within the individual becomes both obstacle and teacher. By naming, feeling, and understanding the impulses we hide, our cruelty, our envy, our cowardice, we take the first step toward reclaiming moral agency. It is an act of courage to walk through the labyrinth of the self, to witness the moral compromises we have made and the darkness we have nurtured. The rot, once illuminated, loses some of its dominion. It becomes a mirror rather than a weapon, a teacher rather than a predator. The night grows heavier. The city hums with the quiet noises of lives that, like ours, conceal moral compromises beneath orderly facades. The alleyways, the rain, the puddles, they are not only external, they reflect the internal landscape of rot, the filth that resides in every unexamined thought, every ignored impulse, every decision to avoid truth. To confront the age of filth, the individual must first confront the rot within, allowing the shadow to speak and listening without flinching. Only then does the journey toward consciousness, and perhaps redemption, begin. The city is not merely a backdrop. It is a mirror. Every street corner, every neon flicker, every damp alleyway reflects not just light, but the intricate lattice of human choices, compromises, and concealed impulses. The filth we tolerate externally, littered streets, systemic corruption, bureaucratic apathy, is inseparable from the internal rot of those who inhabit it. Nietzsche once wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster." This principle scales from the individual psyche to entire societies. The collective filth we observe in politics, institutions, or culture is simultaneously a reflection of what each citizen harbors and neglects. The Age of Filth is thus both interior and exterior, a feedback loop where personal denial magnifies societal decay, and societal decay in turn reinforces personal denial. Consider the moral compromises quietly embedded in everyday life. Bribes, small deceptions, silent complicity in systemic injustices. They seem trivial in isolation but accumulate, like invisible sludge, into a river of collective corruption. Each unexamined impulse that drives self-interest or prejudice contributes to structures that perpetuate inequity and exploitation. The philosopher Aldous Huxley reminds us, most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. In the Age of Filth, this capacity is lethal. It allows rot to embed itself in legal frameworks, economic policies, and cultural norms, while individuals remain convinced of their virtue simply because they have not yet confronted their own shadow. The psychological mechanism behind this is projection. Jung emphasized that the shadow is projected onto others when denied in oneself. In practice, this can manifest as scapegoating, stereotyping, or moral panic, where entire groups of people are demonized for qualities we refuse to recognize in ourselves. The result is a social mirror that distorts reality. The world appears filthier than it is, precisely because our perception is colored by what we have refused to acknowledge internally. When a society becomes saturated with unexamined shadows, its members begin to interpret ambiguity as threat, dissent as corruption, and difference as contamination. The rot multiplies quietly but inexorably, often under the guise of righteousness. Yet recognition is possible. Sartre's assertion that freedom is what you do with what's been done to you speaks directly to the potential for conscious engagement with these dynamics. Individuals can begin to identify their projections, disentangle personal shadow from external reality, and resist being consumed by societal decay. But this is neither simple nor painless. To confront the rot within is to risk alienation, for once shadows are acknowledged, the illusions that sustain comfort and social harmony fracture. The streets, the institutions, the cultural rituals, they all appear complicit in the moral inertia that individuals had once accepted as normal. This confrontation demands a level of courage and self-honesty that few are willing to muster. Yet without it, the cycle of filth is unbroken. There is also an existential dimension to this recognition. Viktor Frankl suggested that meaning emerges through conscious choice, even amidst suffering. In the context of societal rot, this means that individual reflection and moral clarity can influence collective outcomes. Each person who confronts their shadow, who resists projection, and who refuses silent complicity creates a fissure in the dam of decay, a crack through which consciousness can leak back into the world. The Age of Filth is thus not absolute. It is a stage, a challenge, a test of whether the human spirit can reclaim agency in a context increasingly dominated by denial and corruption. Rain continues to fall, and the neon reflections shimmer in the puddles like fractured mirrors. Each drop, each gleam, seems to whisper, the world outside is inseparable from the world inside. The streets and institutions are not foreign. They are extensions of our moral and psychological landscapes. To confront the Age of Filth, one must recognize the reflection, acknowledge the rot, and then, however incrementally, act to purify not only the streets and systems but the conscience itself. This is the threshold, the boundary between passive complicity and deliberate engagement, between being consumed by decay and choosing to illuminate it. The confrontation is brutal. The Age of Filth does not yield gently to awareness. It demands acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths, both internal and external. The streets we inhabit, the institutions we navigate, even our closest relationships. Everything becomes a test of perception and moral courage. This confrontation is not merely an ethical choice. It is an existential imperative. Nietzsche's admonition resonates here. Invisible threads are the strongest ties. The filth that binds the world is invisible, woven into assumptions, habits, and projections. To pull at these threads is to risk unraveling the fabric of familiar reality. Yet without this effort, the decay remains unchecked, and consciousness remains complicit in the perpetuation of rot. To confront filth is to engage with the shadow without illusion. Jung insisted that unacknowledged shadow elements, when projected, can appear monstrous, alien, even irredeemable, but these are aspects of ourselves denied and disowned. In practice, this requires brutal honesty, recognizing envy where we might prefer pride, cruelty where we would prefer benevolence, and fear where we insist on courage. The process is destabilizing because it exposes the thin boundary between self and other, virtue and vice. It is tempting to retreat into moral certainty, to scapegoat or to rationalize inaction. Yet the very act of retreat deepens the filth, allowing denial to accumulate into a moral sediment that hardens like concrete around the soul. True confrontation demands both vigilance and humility, a willingness to witness ourselves without flinching. The societal implications of this process are profound. When individuals begin to face their own shadows, they disrupt the cycles of projection that fuel collective decay. Sartre's observation that man is a being who makes himself by his choices illuminates the stakes. Conscious moral engagement alters not only personal behavior but ripples outward into communities, institutions, and cultural narratives. Resistance to filth, then, is not merely symbolic. It is an active reshaping of the moral ecology. Each act of honesty, each refusal to participate in subtle corruption, each recognition of personal complicity in collective rot, chips away at the structural filth that saturates society. This is the threshold where moral courage becomes revolutionary. The psychological weight of such confrontation cannot be overstated. Viktor Frankl noted, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." In the age of filth, much of the external world may seem immovable, yet transformation begins in the interior. By confronting shadow impulses and acknowledging complicity, the individual reclaims agency, carving spaces of clarity and meaning even in the midst of chaos. This is not a path for the faint of heart. It requires the capacity to dwell in discomfort, to accept that moral clarity often brings isolation, and to persist even when the world seems indifferent or hostile to integrity. The paradox is clear. Filth thrives in denial, yet confrontation of that filth strengthens resilience, moral insight, and consciousness itself. There is also a transcendent dimension. As one learns to navigate the labyrinth of shadow, the boundaries between filth and purity, chaos and order, begin to blur. One realizes that the Age of Filth is not simply a historical or social phenomenon. It is a psychological condition, embedded in perception, morality, and choice. Aldous Huxley captured this interplay. There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception. The confrontation of filth opens these doors. The darkness of self and society no longer simply intimidates. It instructs. By facing it, one discovers pathways to creativity, ethical clarity, and transformative understanding. A way of living that refuses passive complicity and instead fosters conscious engagement with reality in all its moral and psychological complexity. Rain falls on streets that are neither clean nor entirely corrupted. They are mirrors of the choices we make, the shadows we embrace or reject. To confront the filth is to look into these mirrors without flinching, to acknowledge the rot, and to act. Every small act of clarity, honesty, and courage becomes a spark in the darkness, illuminating a path through a world that often seems designed to conceal its own corruption. Confrontation is not the endpoint. It is the threshold of awareness, the hinge on which the journey toward consciousness and redemption swings. The city exhales a heavy, damp breath, as if the weight of human compromise has permeated every brick, every puddle, every dimly lit alley. Yet within this oppressive atmosphere lies the potential for transformation. The Age of Filth, while terrifying in its pervasiveness, is not immutable. It is, in essence, a reflection of choices made, denied, or evaded both by individuals and by society. As Jung reminds us, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Redemption, therefore, does not arrive through denial, idealization, or moral fantasy. It is forged in the deliberate, conscious confrontation with shadow and rot. This confrontation is both intimate and collective. The individual who has faced their inner filth becomes a microcosm of resistance against the pervasive decay. Yet personal integrity alone is insufficient. It must ripple outward, influencing the structures, habits, and relationships that sustain collective filth. Schopenhauer observed, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." By extending awareness beyond personal boundaries, by challenging institutional inertia, confronting societal hypocrisy, and refusing silent complicity, one begins to expand the moral horizon. Redemption, then, is inseparable from responsibility. It requires active engagement with the external world as a reflection of the internal. The path toward redemption is labyrinthine, fraught with psychological and existential peril. Fear, guilt, and despair threaten at every turn, yet these obstacles are integral to the journey. Sartre's insight that freedom is what you do with what's been done to you emphasizes that even in the face of systemic rot, individual choice retains its power. The conscious acknowledgement of shadow, the refusal to project inner darkness onto others, and the deliberate cultivation of integrity become acts of defiance against the age of filth. Each choice is a fissure in the edifice of decay, a subtle but persistent assertion of moral and psychological agency. Yet redemption is not merely moral, it is profoundly transformative. Aldous Huxley's reflection, "There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception," resonates here. The confrontation with darkness and filth enlarges consciousness, opening doors previously obscured by fear, denial, or ignorance. This transformation allows the individual to perceive reality with a heightened sensitivity, to navigate moral ambiguity with clarity, and to act with a combination of courage, empathy, and discernment. The filth that once threatened to overwhelm becomes a teacher, revealing the structures of projection, the mechanics of denial, and the pathways to resilience. The integration of shadow is central to this process. Jungian psychology emphasizes that the unexamined shadow exerts silent tyranny over thoughts and actions. By embracing what was once denied, individuals achieve a profound internal coherence, aligning desires, conscience, and perception in a way that resists the chaos of external filth. Viktor Frankl's assertion, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom," encapsulates the essence of this integration. Moral and psychological agency is reclaimed in the space of conscious choice, even amidst pervasive corruption. Each decision to act ethically, each refusal to perpetuate projection, consolidates a fragile but real domain of redemption. Finally, the age of filth ceases to be a sentence and becomes a challenge, a call to consciousness. The streets, institutions, and human relationships, once oppressive in their reflection of decay, now offer the opportunity for illumination. The individual who has confronted shadow and rot finds not despair but possibility. The possibility to cultivate integrity in thought, action, and perception. The possibility to influence others by example. The possibility to transform what was once mirrored filth into a path of insight, moral clarity, and resilience. Redemption, in this sense, is not the eradication of darkness, but the conscious, deliberate mastery of one's response to it, a luminous defiance against the pervasive age of filth. As the rain subsides and the city exhales into the night, a quiet truth remains. The filth outside is inseparable from the filth inside, yet both are permeable. Confrontation, acknowledgement, and integration transform decay into opportunity, shadow into insight, and despair into moral agency. In the end, the age of filth is neither absolute nor eternal. It is a challenge, demanding courage, reflection, and conscious choice. Those who dare to meet it, who illuminate the darkness within themselves and their world, carry the possibility of redemption into even the bleakest corners of human existence.